I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you for having me. My name is Heather Maguire, and I have a doctorate in educational psychology, and I am a board certified behavior analyst. And so recently, Denora and Chris, who are the founders of the Non-Expert page, approached me because they found me. I have a podcast. So my podcast is called Prism Parenting. And on my podcast, I talk a lot about different things all related to parenting. And so they had come across my podcast. And specifically, actually, one of the things they were really interested in hearing more about was picky eating, which it's kind of fun because today with all of you, that's what I get to talk about is picky eating. So I have two kids of my own. Landon is 8 years old and Addie is 6. So Landon's in the 3rd grade and Addie is in the 1st grade. And professionally, I am a professor, as well as I've done in-home behavioral therapy. So if you've heard of applied behavior analysis, it's basically, lots of times people just refer to it as ABA. And so what my background is before I was a professor is I went into homes of kids who either had a diagnosis of autism or were at risk for autism. And in starting Prism, one of the reasons why was because when I was in my doctorate program working with kids on the autism spectrum, a lot of parents would ask me for resources. So I would go in and do in-home behavioral therapy for kids with autism, but they were looking for resources for typically developing kids. And so I would look for resources to give to them, but unfortunately, a lot of what is out there on the internet, which you probably know if you've spent any amount of time searching for answers for parenting questions, so much of what's out there, unfortunately, is not based upon research. It's just based upon people's opinions. So long story short, that was a while ago, and I decided about a year ago to actually move forward with my dream and to start Prism Behavior. So I have a weekly podcast, which you can check out, all again about things related to parenting. So for example, today we'll talk about picky eating. That's a topic I've talked about on my podcast before. But also, I talk about sleep issues, defiance, things like that. So again, Chris and Denora, what they wanted me to talk about today was picky eating. I know they've said that they have a picky eater, and even here now as a professional, before I was a behavior analyst, I had my first kiddo, and lo and behold, he was a picky eater. And so, and then as I, kind of grew in my profession, I was able to use a lot of behavioral techniques to work with him. And so I'm going to share some of those things with you today. Also, I want to give a really quick disclaimer. So I'm a board certified behavior analyst, and I've again worked in the field of behavior with kids for a long time, and I have that experience. But yet, here's what I have to say. This topic of picky eating, the things I'm going to go over today are really related to those of you who have kids who might have like mild to moderate issues with your kids in terms of picky eating. So if for whatever reason, you have a situation where you're concerned for your kids' safety and well-being, like if they really aren't eating, or if they're having issues like throwing up and gagging while they're eating, you might still find some interesting information today, but I really would suggest that you talk to your pediatrician or somebody else about that as well, just to make sure that you're on track and whatnot. So okay, so what I'm going to do, I think it's best if I kind of break down the information about picky eating by age group. Okay, so there'll be a lot of different things that I talk about that are really related to kids of any different age group, but I think it's helpful. So for those of you who have babies who are just starting to eat solid foods, you can actually start now, with your kids. So the biggest and the best thing that you can do with little kids who are just starting with solid foods is to make sure to give them a variety of different foods. And here's the deal. Even, as you're giving them that variety of foods, even if they don't like each and every food that you're presenting to them, what I would encourage you to do is actually present the same food to them, several times. So obviously, you shouldn't force your baby, to eat anything. Specifically, if you're like, no, I wish he would just eat his green beans, and, it's not successful. Clearly, you're not going to make your child eat that. But what I would say is this: make sure that you offer it several times to them. them. And I know it can get a little bit frustrating because nobody wants to throw foods away and whatnot, but as much as possible, just keep offering it to them, because here's what the research says. It says that a lot of times people have to be exposed to the same food several times before they begin to like it. And really, I've experienced that time and time again with my own kids, where there are certain things that they used to not like, and then, by repeatedly trying it, their repertoire of what they like has expanded so much. So from the early days, from babies, make sure to give them a variety of foods. So here's the deal though. Here's what happened to me, kind of like a funny story from when my kids were little. My son was not a picky eater for, initially when we started giving him solid foods. He would eat everything, okay? But all of a sudden, one day, what happened was that I gave him something, I think it may have been eggs, okay? And it was something, lots of kids don't like eggs, but it was something that he had eaten previously. He never had an issue with eggs before. But right around like the 13 to 14 month old mark, what started to happen was in that certain situation, he refused to eat them. And it was surprising to me. But that's a lot of times what we'll see is, even though, maybe initially your kids will eat, certain foods, they all of a sudden realize at a certain point in time that they have an opinion and that there's no way you can make them eat the food, right? So a lot of times kids, they don't have a lot of control in areas of their lives. And really, this is one area that they do have control. And so, I remember that day is kind of like a turning point. And little did I know that he was about to become a really picky eater. So again, if you experience that with your kids, that they weren't picky and that they were, don't be discouraged. It's pretty normal. And, preference changes. So here's a few things for toddlers though. So moving on to kind of toddlers. Here's what I would recommend. As much as possible, don't make separate meals for them. Because like in the moment, it's kind of easy to pull something out of the freezer, and by the way, no mom guilt or dad guilt allowed. If you're listening to this and you're like, I make separate meals for my kids all the time, that is totally fine. I'm just saying, if you haven't started, I wouldn't recommend it. As much as possible, what I would recommend is whatever you eat as a family, unless it's like too spicy or, maybe you're worried like a really little kid would choke on bones from fish or something, as much as possible, where it makes sense, have your kids eat whatever you're eating, just in like smaller bites and smaller amounts. That's what I would recommend. And feed them what you would feed like the rest of your family. So if you haven't started making separate meals for your kids, don't. And if you have, don't worry, because I'll talk a little bit about what you can do in those certain situations, okay? But, so here's the deal though. If you are trying this and your kids are completely refusing to eat meals, you might need to resort, especially for toddlers who have, little understanding of the future and, who don't have a lot of language, you might have to be creative for a period of time. So let me tell you about what we did. So with Landon, he became a picky eater, and I didn't, I kind of waited it out for a little while and tried different things, and they weren't working. So finally I found something that would work for us. I just kind of started to experiment and get a little bit creative. And what worked for us, and this is totally weird, okay, was that I would mix his food with hummus, of all things, put it in the blender, and then he would eat it. Weirdest thing ever, but it worked. And so, at the time I was like, well, I want him to eat nutritious foods. So at least I don't have to make him a separate meal. So I was creative for a period of time. Other ways to be creative, for example, I hear parents all the time sneaking in healthy foods, healthy veggies into, like, let's say you make like a marinara sauce and your child loves spaghetti or pasta. That's something that's really easy to maybe sneak some of those like veggies into and stuff. So if you have to be creative, definitely do that. And so for us, for a period of time, that worked. But at a certain point of time, I'm like, okay, look, kid, like I cannot be just mixing your food with hummus all day for the rest of your life. So I'll get into in a little bit what we ended up doing to get past that hummus situation. Okay, still with toddlers, what I want you guys to do is be mindful of snacks. So kids definitely need to eat snacks, and don't expect your kids to only eat their meals and then nothing in between. You definitely want them to eat snacks, but here's what I would suggest. Most of the time when kids are toddlers, one decent snack in between meals is enough. Now you have to make a judgment call. Again, I always say, parents, you're the experts of your own kids. But a lot of times if you choose the right snack, one that has, let's say, protein in it, it will allow your child to get to it from one meal to the next. And so And it's okay if you want to also have, mix in with the protein, some sort of cracker or something like that. That's totally fine. But here's what I would suggest not doing. It's the snacking like all day long, where if you have a kid who's a picky eater, what happens is if they fill up on, let's say, several snacks of crackers or puffs or whatever you're giving them, and then they're not eating their meals. So here's what could potentially be happening. They're just not hungry, So of course they want to eat things either with sugar in them or salt, that's, I don't know. I like crackers. I don't know about you. And so what could potentially start to happen is that they fill up on those things and then they're less inclined to eat meals. So if you find that happening, just ensure that you limit the amount of snacks kids are getting. Focus on those snacks that are high in protein. And then what you can do, I would say this, like, you probably don't necessarily want to say, you may not eat any food right now. Kids, we do want them to start to realize when they're hungry. So one of the things that you can do is have a special spot either in your fridge or, in your cupboard of like healthy things that are always available. So for example, my kids know if they ask for, let's say, carrots or some type of fruit, most fruits, I'm going to typically say yes, no matter what time of day it is. Because here's the deal. Carrots aren't that filling, okay? And so plus, like, let's say they eat carrots 30 minutes before it's time to eat dinner. Which parent would ever really care that their kid filled up on those things instead of dinner, right? So in terms of snacks, be mindful, but maybe perhaps come up with a list of snacks that your kids have access to all the time and see if that helps in terms of eating meals. The next thing I want to talk about is, again with toddlers, is making sure to incorporate choices into the eating routine. And so, by the way, choices are important pretty much all the way through. Not when kids are first starting to eat. They're not going to be able to make choices when they're, say, like 11 months old, 12 months old, you're feeding them baby food, maybe not then. But as kids get a little bit older, they can make choices in between small amounts of items, okay? So what you could do potentially is, let's say for a toddler, an appropriate number of choices might be actually like 2 or 3 items, okay? So you might say, would you like to have this or this? And so by giving kids back a little bit of control, we get more of their buy-in, and then they're more likely, to eat what we've offered. So we want to have their buy-in to the process. So one way is to give them choices in the moment. Another way is to help them, is to allow them help you with meal planning and meal preparation. If kids make something, if kids make the decisions, they're more likely to comply and to eat what you've made. So this is true with toddlers, but it actually goes and runs the whole gamut. So for example, if you're trying to get your kids to, let's say, eat healthy lunches or to not be so picky about what you're putting in their lunch for either, preschool or elementary school, you can incorporate choices as well. So what we do in our own house, again, my kids are a little bit, they're not toddlers, they're 6 and 8, first and third grade. And so one of the things we do for lunches is we have kind of like a list of what they include in their lunches. So they help make the sandwiches for their lunch. And then I say, okay, pick a fruit. Pick, let's say, a snack that might be like, a fun snack like cookies or something like that. So pick a fruit, pick a fun snack, pick a protein snack. So they might have like, a little bit of nuts or like some type of nut bar, right? Pick a fruit and then pick a vegetable as well. So what I do, at least with my own kids, and by the way, at this point, they're really not that picky. You might not, at this point, you might have to start small. Your kids might not agree or might not be successful having them, actually choose to have like a vegetable in their lunch, okay? But eventually, that could be the goal. But just by offering them choices and allowing them to participate in that, you're going to see pickiness go down and they're more likely to eat more things, okay? Okay, so moving on. So in our house, now that my kids are older, and again, so now we're going to move on to like preschool and early elementary, where most kids have a decent amount of language and they are starting to have some reasoning skills, okay? So at this point, for my kids, they know that the rule in our house is that they need to eat a little bit of everything. So the rule in our house is that our kids are required to eat a little bit of everything. So this might be a little bit controversial, but what I do say is that my kids in this stage in their life, they need to have at least one bite of whatever food I've prepared, okay? And, some people say, oh, you would never want to make kids eat, things that they don't want to eat or, force them. At this point, I'm not forcing them. I do have enough authority in their lives that it's not this like big struggle. So I never make them clean their plate. I never make them, they get to choose how much they eat. But I just say to them, and I try not to prepare things that they absolutely hate. I know there's things that my daughter hates and I try not to make it. And if I make something that she hates, I'm not going to make her take a bite of that. Okay. But for most things, requiring your kids when they're this age to take a bite of everything, they can handle it. And I recommend it again because what the research shows is that it takes a lot of times for you to get used to the texture and the taste of things. So again, ensuring that your kids eat a bite of everything, I do recommend it. You're not going to use it with the really little kids. And also, it's worth noting that at a certain point of time, this becomes inappropriate, right? That's not appropriate for teenagers. There's no way I'm going to be able to tell my 13-year-old child that they need to take a bite of everything, okay? So I'm trying to instill that into my kids right now, so that hopefully as, the time progresses, and as parents, we need to progressively kind of loosen up with our kids, right? And so as the time goes on, I'm trying to give more and more control over to my kids. And so once they're teenagers and in high school, they're going to have to decide how many snacks they're going to eat. I'll decide what I buy from the grocery store with some of their input, but they're going to have to make those decisions. So, definitely in early elementary school and let's say preschool, instituting this take a bite of everything is appropriate. I think it's, not harmful in most situations. And so kind of going back to the story I talked about in the beginning, about my son and the hummus. So if any of you guys are just tuning in now, basically what we did when my son, when he was a toddler, is we used to put his dinner in the blender with hummus because it's the only way I could get him to eat a variety of things. And then what eventually happened is after a few months of doing this, I was like, okay, well, this behavior is not really stopping. What am I going to do about it? Okay, so in terms of troubleshooting, what I started to do was to basically require, what I would do is I would put a let's say, something that he really wanted to eat on the side, or, he could see it, right? He was in a high chair at the time, so he couldn't grab it, but he could see it. And then I would have whatever we were having for dinner, and I would say, take a bite, then you can have this, right? So what I was doing there is actually coming up with kind of like an informal reward system, rewarding him for trying that item. So there's a lot of different ways you could do that. If you want to expand the types of food your child is willing to try, you might even temporarily, again, this is some controversial for some, but honestly, it's, when done only sometimes, I don't think it's such a big deal, but you might even decide to do something like buy some gummy bears and say, look, if you try a bite of this, I'll give you a gummy bear, but you need to swallow it. You decide how big the bite is. So as the kids are getting older, you can start to do that sort of thing to get them to try. One thing I would say, though, is you want to start small in order to be successful. Because if you start too big, what will happen is that your child will become distressed. You'll become distressed, and we don't want that sort of thing to happen. We don't want your child to develop an unhealthy relationship with eating. So it shouldn't be this huge dramatic thing, but those are just some different ways that you guys can incorporate different things that are relatively easy to do to decrease picky eating in your home. I don't know if you've heard of intuitive eating. So intuitive eating is kind of a buzzword right now, and I'm actually doing a podcast episode about it in the near future. So something kind of came across my social media, and I joined a Facebook group about intuitive eating for kids. And as a professional, I had already heard of intuitive eating, but I had heard of it, so it kind of came out in the last few decades. And really, it was to support individuals with eating disorders. And so in doing some research for my future podcast, one of the things I did was I looked at some of the things related to intuitive eating, and then I joined, again, like I said, this Facebook group, but the Facebook group is specifically on intuitive eating for kids. So, but from the individuals who started intuitive eating, what it is, what they've described in their own words, there's 10 pillars, but the three that they talk about the most about are, or the three kind of things that kind of connect with all 10 pillars are this. So eating for physical rather than emotional reasons, rather than comfort. relying on internal hunger and being satiated cues, so like don't clear your plate, just thinking about if you're hungry, and then unconditional permission to eat, so when you're hungry and what food is desired. So, and one of the big things they do is they don't, they discourage people from labeling foods as good or bad, unhealthy or healthy. And like I said, this kind of comes out of like the eating disorder community, and it definitely, there's a lot of evidence that it supports individuals who have eating disorders. But more recently, a lot of experts have started to realize that a lot of times kids are picking up on what, if their parents might have disordered eating habits, kids are always watching. And so, people have started to generalize these concepts to kids. And I do like some of it, but I kind of wanted to talk through some of the things that I find challenging when it comes to intuitive eating and some of the questions I have, So in terms of eating for physical rather than emotional reasons, I totally think that that's appropriate. Teaching kids to be in touch with, if they're hungry or not. I think that that's awesome. I also think that as parents, we have to be really mindful of, it's okay to tell our kids that we want to be healthy, but we never want to talk about, oh, I need to go on a diet, or, I want to lose weight. And again, if you've talked about those things with your kids in the past, it's okay. Kids are very resilient in general, but be mindful of that in the future because they're listening. I can actually remember myself when I was in, I think, 6th or 7th grade, I decided, and it wasn't because of my parents, but it was more about the media and other kids at school. I decided to go on a diet, even when I was maybe 12 or 13. So kids are always listening, so be really careful about how you're talking about food with your kids. And yeah, a lot of these relationships with food start when we're little. Here's the deal though, and here's where kind of my philosophy in terms of behavioral science, how it differs from intuitive eating specifically. I don't think that kids have the willpower to understand always to make the decisions about what to eat. So definitely I'm not going to tell my kids about how much to eat. That's up to them. But I do think that, me being able to show them the foods that are available and to say, hey, here's what I'm offering. And I'm not going to give you another serving of, let's say, your dinner roll because you didn't touch the rest of your plate. As a behavioral, as a professional, I don't see that, I would need to do that. And if you follow intuitive eating, you could potentially say okay, have as many dinner rolls as you want. I'm offering it for dinner and whatnot. So anyways, I don't know if you guys have heard about intuitive eating or anything like that, but that's some of my thoughts about that, as well as I do think it's okay for us to label foods as certain foods as being very healthy and more other foods as being, not so healthy. Again, not tied to weight, but just tied to nutrition. So I am telling my kids we do want to eat as many fruits and vegetables as possible. I don't make them feel guilty. We can eat ice cream and we can totally enjoy it, but ice cream has less nutritional value. Okay, so that's some thoughts there. They say, we have noticed that our son will sometimes eat fine for a bit, so we know he likes the food, but he doesn't want us to feed him anymore. He's 1. We notice that he doesn't always eat enough this way, but he gets angry when we try to feed him more. Can we encourage him to eat enough? Okay, so, I think the biggest thing is by having scheduled periods of time when food is available. And by the way, initially this might, cause a little bit of stress, but so you could there's a few options. You can either say okay, food, you can only bring out food kind of at scheduled increments of time. And then, when your child is wanting to have food, and obviously since he's 1, he probably has very little language, but if you could tell he's hungry, you might kind of stretch it out a little bit longer. We don't want 1-year-olds to be really hungry, but we can still be more structured in terms of when food is available. But what you could potentially do, it is true that it's very common and normal for kids to want to feed themselves, independence. And honestly, as parents, we do want to encourage our kids to be independent, but sometimes it can drive us nuts in the process. I don't think you need to try to feed him more. I think you can more use the environment of you could potentially take the food that he hasn't eaten and put it into a container. And then if he's hungry later, you could potentially represent that same food. I would go away from presenting different food, but you could do that. So yeah, kind of the 2 options would be, feeding them, and then when it's available, then they're more likely to eat, and then just not presenting food until the next time where, if it's a scheduled snack or scheduled meal. So that's one option. Or you could take the food that they didn't eat, put it aside, and then represent that same food. That would be some options. If we prepare food for him and he doesn't want anything at all, but we know that he has to be hungry because it's been hours since he's eaten. What can we do to help him eat? Do we just take him out of the high chair and try again later? Or is there something we can do to encourage him to eat? So if it's not extreme, so by the way, so I've worked with individuals who have autism who have extreme sensitivities, more extreme sensitivities to food. Like sometimes kids with autism, they only eat French fries. Like I've met those kids before and their parents don't know what to do. And again, it's totally different. That's why they have a professional come into their home. But when we work with a kid like that, you can imagine the nutritional deficit if all you eat is French fries, right? And so, there's different things you can try, but, we in those situations resort to a little bit more extreme situations. So for example, things that, we've had to use before is say eat this one bite, then you can get down. So basically we would wait until the child ate at least one bite and then they could get down. And we set that kind of as like a contingency. But again, that can be pretty aversive. I think kind of like what I said before of then when your child starts to realize that food is only available at certain scheduled times, they're more likely to eat. And again, what you might do is offer up, even a 1-year-old can start to make choices. They're not going to tell you verbally what they want, but if you offer 2 foods and you present it to them and you say, would you like this or this, then they might be more likely to eat a little bit more. But thanks, Chris and Denora, for inviting me. I think it's such an awesome thing that you're doing on your page, and I hope I can come on again in the future.
Mama.